When Jake Thompson discovered his golden wheat field ablaze, his first thought wasn't the fire. It was Marjorie Latham standing nearby, smirking like she had won. A week later, she walked into his courtroom as the defendant, and Jake realized the battle for justice was only just beginning. The mornings in Wheat County were always quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost sacred. The sun would rise slowly over the horizon, painting the fields with gold and amber light, and the only sounds were the distant low hum of tractors and the occasional chirp of a bird. I had grown up on this farm, inherited it from my father, and each year I poured myself into it with the same care and patience he had. Every spring, I planted the wheat, carefully spacing the seeds, tending to the soil, and praying for rain at the right time. Each stalk that sprouted was a promise of harvest, of stability, of a connection to generations before me. Life here wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real, and it was mine. Neighbors waved as they drove past on dusty gravel roads, exchanging brief hellos or nods of acknowledgement. Children played in the yard without fear, running barefoot across the fields, their laughter carried on the wind. It was a life where everyone knew each other's rhythms, where trust was assumed and honesty valued. I liked it that way. I liked the predictability of it. Every morning, every season, every year, the world felt contained, manageable, and safe. That sense of security, however, was about to be shattered in a way I could never have anticipated. The trouble didn't come from nature or from rival farmers. It came from the Homeowners Association. On paper, the HOA existed to keep the community orderly, to make sure properties were maintained, fences were straight, and lawns looked presentable. In practice, it was controlled by one woman with a ferocious sense of authority, Marjorie Latham. She had been president for nearly a decade, a small woman with a precise appearance and an even sharper tongue. She had rules for everything and an uncanny ability to turn minor infractions into moral failings. At first, I thought she was just a stickler for order, someone who cared too much about appearances. Over time, her influence felt more like a weight pressing down on the neighborhood, a reminder that no one could move freely without her scrutiny. Our first disagreement had been small and petty, a dispute over the height of a fence between my farm and a neighbor's property. Marjorie had sent a letter criticizing my failure to maintain the paint and insisting it reflected poorly on the community. I brushed it off, thinking it was a minor annoyance, but the letters continued over the years, each one more demanding and intrusive than the last. I tried to avoid her, focusing on my farm and leaving the HOA drama to others, but her presence loomed over every decision, every action. She made the rules, and everyone, eventually, learned to obey or face her wrath. That October morning, everything changed. I had woken early, as I always did, to check the weather and take in the sunrise. The sky was painted in warm streaks of pink and gold, a perfect day for working in the fields. I stepped onto the porch, holding a cup of coffee, enjoying the smell of dew-soaked soil mixed with the earthy aroma of roasted beans. It should have been a peaceful start, the kind of calm that reminded me why I loved this life. But there was something wrong. A faint haze hung over the far edge of my property, curling unnaturally as if the air itself had caught fire. My first thought was fog, a natural morning mist, but it didn't move or dissipate. It thickened, curling upward, dark and ominous. My heart began to race as I squinted into the distance. Then I saw it, flames, small at first, licking the edges of my golden wheat. Panic hit me like a physical blow. My fields, the product of months of work, the legacy of my family, were on fire. Smoke spiraled into the sky, carrying the acrid smell of burning grain. I ran toward the field, fear and disbelief twisting inside me. Neighbors appeared, drawn by the smoke and the shouting. Someone called the fire department, and their sirens began to wail in the distance. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How could this happen? Who would do this? Then I noticed the tire tracks, leading from the nearby road straight toward the field. The pattern of the tracks, the timing, the audacity, it all pointed to a person who knew exactly what they were doing. My stomach sank as a chilling thought took root. Marjorie Latham. The idea seemed impossible at first. She was a neighbor, a community leader. But I couldn't ignore the pattern, the history of tension, the petty wars over fence lines and paint. My wheat, my livelihood, was gone in minutes, reduced to blackened stubble. I sank to my knees in the dirt, staring at the devastation, feeling a mix of fury, disbelief, and helplessness. The morning sun, once comforting, now felt harsh and accusatory, illuminating the destruction like it was demanding an explanation I couldn't provide. That day, the world I had known, the steady rhythm of farm life, the sense of safety, the belief that hard work protected you, was shattered. Something had crossed a line, and I knew deep down that Wheat County would never be the same again. For the first time, I realized that the quiet life I had cherished was fragile, that even in the middle of endless fields and wide-open skies, conflict could erupt in the most destructive way. My fight was only beginning. The fire that had destroyed my wheat field lingered in my mind like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. The morning after, I returned to the field, walking carefully through the blackened stalks, my boots sinking into the ash. The smell of burned wheat was pungent, almost suffocating, and it seemed to cling to everything I touched. My heart ached as I looked at the ruined crops, the golden sea I had nurtured for months reduced to a charred wasteland. I had invested my life into this harvest, the seeds, the labor, the hope of a profitable season, and it was gone in an instant. There was no insurance payout for emotional devastation, no repair that could restore the sense of loss that wrapped around me like a vice. Neighbors came by, some offering help, others just curiosity. A few whispered theories, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid to speak too loudly about the obvious suspect. Marjorie Latham. She had a reputation for controlling every aspect of the neighborhood, and she had no shortage of enemies, but burning someone's livelihood was a new level. I tried not to think about it too much, tried to focus on practicalities, documenting the damage, taking photographs, making notes. Every burnt stalk, every footprint in the ash, every irregularity in the fire pattern was evidence. I knew I had to be methodical. The police arrived mid-morning, trucks kicking up dust as they pulled into my driveway. Officers stepped out with notebooks, cameras, and a calm, professional demeanor that almost clashed with the chaos of the scene. They asked questions I barely knew how to answer. Had I seen anyone near the field? Any unusual vehicles? Could I think of anyone who might have a reason to do this? I swallowed hard and gave them what I knew, careful not to let anger color my words. But my mind kept circling back to Marjorie. She had been at the center of so many disputes, her personality sharp and vindictive. It was impossible to ignore the pattern. I spent the day combing through the edge of the field, searching for clues. Tire tracks were visible in the damp soil along the perimeter, leading straight from the main road and fading toward the tree. The pattern suggested a truck or heavy vehicle, one capable of carrying flammable materials. I photographed every detail, making sure to preserve the evidence for the police. My neighbors watched silently from their porches, some offering quiet condolences, others mere curiosity. A few muttered under their breath about Marjorie, though none of them spoke directly to me. Fear, I realized, had a way of making people silent, even when they knew the truth. By midday, news had spread through the small town. Farmers from nearby fields drove by, slowing down to look at the blackened area. Some offered words of sympathy, others simply shook their heads. I nodded at each greeting, though inside I felt hollow. This field was more than property. It was pride, inheritance, proof that hard work could yield tangible results. Now it was gone, and with it, a sense of security I hadn't realized I'd taken for granted. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, police visits, and phone calls. The insurance company was slow, sending adjusters who took photographs, scribbled notes, and offered polite reassurances. None of it mattered. The harvest was gone. The reality was crushing. I spent hours walking through the remnants of my field, letting my fingers brush against the charred stalks, imagining what it had been a week earlier. Golden waves rippling in the wind, heavy heads of grain ready to be harvested, the sun warm on my back as I worked. The contrast between what had been and what remained was staggering. In the evenings, I replayed the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it. How had someone gotten close enough to ignite the fire without being caught? Who had motive strong enough to destroy months of work? My thoughts kept returning to Marjorie, the HOA president who had a history of micromanaging, intimidating, and punishing neighbors who didn't comply with her vision of perfection. Could she really have gone this far? I didn't want to believe it at first, but as I pieced together the timeline, the tracks, and the presence of chemical residues the fire department mentioned, a pattern began to emerge. I knew I couldn't wait for the authorities to solve it on their own. I began compiling evidence, photographs, witness statements, notes on suspicious activity around the farm. A neighbor finally spoke up after days of silence, mentioning seeing Marjorie's truck parked near the edge of my property before sunrise on the day of the fire. Another neighbor recalled a strange smell in the early morning, like gasoline mixed with smoke. Each tiny detail, when put together, painted a damning picture. Sleep was impossible. At night, I lay awake, imagining the fire leaping through the wheat, feeling the heat as though it were still there, watching my livelihood consumed. Anger, frustration, and fear mingled in my chest. I realized that this wasn't just about wheat. This was personal. It was about justice, about making sure that whoever had destroyed my farm paid for it. The fire had taken everything I could see, but it hadn't taken my determination. By the end of the week, I had a plan. I would meet with the authorities again, present all the evidence I had gathered, and push for an investigation that left no stone unturned. I was tired, emotionally and physically drained, but the sense of purpose kept me going. The golden fields of Wheat County were gone, but the fight for justice had only begun. Something had shifted that week, and I knew that whatever came next would change everything, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. The days following the fire were a blur of frustration and determination. I spent every waking hour trying to piece together what had happened, combing through the charred remains of my wheat field with meticulous attention. Every footprint, every scorched stalk, every line in the ash told a story, and I was determined to read it. The local fire investigators had done their work, documenting burn patterns and chemical traces, but I knew the truth would only emerge if I paid attention to the details they might overlook. It was tedious, exhausting work, but I couldn't let my farm, my family's legacy, be reduced to a cautionary tale of negligence. I photographed everything, making a catalog of destruction that stretched across my computer's hard drive. Tire tracks that led from the main road into the field, patches of accelerant that glinted unnaturally in the sunlight, the remnants of a makeshift ignition point carefully hidden beneath a row of burned wheat stalks. Each piece of evidence pointed to deliberate action, not a random accident. The fire hadn't started naturally, it had been set. And as much as I didn't want to believe it, every detail nudged me toward one conclusion. Marjorie Latham had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. I reached out to neighbors cautiously, trying to gauge what they knew. Many were hesitant to speak, afraid of retaliation from the HOA president, but one brave neighbor finally came forward. He had seen a truck parked at the edge of my property in the early hours of that morning, its engine idling as if someone had been waiting. He described it in careful detail, a dark vehicle with a distinctive set of mud flaps, and his recollection fit perfectly with the tire tracks I had documented. Another neighbor mentioned the smell of something chemical, strong and unnatural, carried by the morning wind. Each testimony strengthened the case I was quietly building. I compiled everything into a binder, labeling photographs, printing witness statements, and taking careful notes. By now, I had a strategy forming in my mind. I wasn't just going to wait for justice to happen. I was going to make sure it did. I scheduled meetings with the local police detective, presenting my evidence calmly, methodically. I could see their skepticism at first. They had seen plenty of petty grievances, but arson was serious. But as I walked them through the physical evidence, the witnesses, and the clear link to Marjorie, their expressions shifted. The case was moving from suspicion to investigation. Meanwhile, Marjorie acted as if nothing had happened. She continued her duties as HOA president, attending meetings, enforcing rules, and maintaining an air of normalcy that infuriated me. It was as if she believed she could burn my livelihood and walk away without consequence. I felt a mix of rage and disbelief. How could someone be so brazen, so utterly confident in their immunity? But that arrogance would be her undoing. As the investigation progressed, I realized how much evidence she had left behind, even unintentionally. The accelerants used in the fire were commercially available, but a local store had sold only a few gallons in the area that week. The receipts, combined with the description of her truck near the field, formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The detective I was working with began to treat the case seriously, following up on leads and taking statements from those who had been too afraid to speak initially. I also reached out to a private investigator, someone who had experience in small-town disputes and a reputation for uncovering hidden truths. He walked the field with me, examining the burn patterns and the surrounding property, and within hours, he confirmed what I had suspected all along. This had been intentional, targeted, and carried out by someone who knew the terrain and timing perfectly. The PI noted the precision of the fire, the way it had been confined to certain rows of wheat while leaving others untouched, and the absence of natural fire accelerants like lightning or dry brush. The conclusion was unavoidable. This had been deliberate sabotage. Even with all this evidence, the emotional toll was immense. I couldn't walk past the remnants of my wheat without feeling a pang of loss and anger. Every stalk had represented months of labor, planning, and hope. Now, they were gone, reduced to ashes that crumbled between my fingers. Friends offered support, neighbors checked in, but nothing could replace what had been taken. At night, I lay awake replaying every detail, imagining how the fire had started, how it had spread, and who had orchestrated it with such calculated precision. The thought that it had been someone I lived near, someone who held authority in our community, made it even harder to digest. By the end of the week, the pieces were falling into place. I had documentation, witness accounts, physical evidence, and a growing sense that the authorities would finally take the situation seriously. I began preparing for the next step, moving beyond investigation toward legal action. I knew that facing someone like Marjorie in court would be challenging. She was smart, manipulative, and unafraid of confrontation. But I also knew that the truth had weight, and I had gathered enough evidence to make that truth undeniable. The fire had destroyed more than wheat. It had ignited a determination in me that I hadn't realized was there. I wasn't just fighting for compensation or property. I was fighting for justice, for the principle that no one could destroy another person's life and walk away unscathed. The burned field was a reminder of what I had lost, but it was also the starting point for what I was determined to win. The battle was just beginning, and I knew the road ahead would be long, tense, and far from easy. But for the first time since the fire, I felt a spark of hope. The truth was on my side, and I was ready to see it brought into the light. The morning I walked into the courtroom, I thought I was prepared. I had rehearsed every detail in my mind, visualized the proceedings, and convinced myself I could remain calm no matter what happened. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment I laid eyes on her. Marjorie Latham, the woman whose hands I believed had set fire to my wheat field, was sitting in the defendant's chair. Her posture was unnervingly composed, her gaze steady and almost smug, as if she already knew how the story would end. The air in the room seemed to shift the instant I saw her, thick with tension, a silent acknowledgement that this confrontation was long overdue. I took my seat, trying to steady my breathing, but my heart hammered in my chest. Every memory of the fire, every smell of burned wheat, every sleepless night replayed in my mind. I could still feel the heat of the flames, the anger and helplessness that had gripped me as I watched months of hard work go up in smoke. And now, here she was, mere feet away, facing the consequences, or at least I hoped she was. The courtroom was buzzing with whispers. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had heard about the fire crowded into the benches, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the woman who had allegedly destroyed my livelihood. Some faces reflected curiosity, others sympathy, and a few, I suspected, fear. They all knew the story, or parts of it, but seeing the two of us in the same room made the situation impossibly real. This wasn't just gossip anymore. This was legal reality, and it felt heavy in the air. The judge called the court to order, a gavel banging that echoed like a starting gun. Everything became procedural after that, swearing in witnesses, reviewing evidence, establishing jurisdiction. But my attention kept drifting back to Marjorie. She sat with her hands folded neatly on the table, her expression carefully neutral, though I could see the faint twitch of a muscle in her jaw. She was trying to appear calm, I realized, but the tension radiating from her was palpable. I didn't need the investigator's testimony to know she was uncomfortable. The first witness was a neighbor who had seen her truck near my property the morning of the fire. His voice trembled slightly as he recounted the sighting, and I felt a surge of relief. His description matched the tire tracks, the timeline, and the chemical residue we had collected. Each detail he provided reinforced the narrative I had been building in my mind for weeks. As he finished, I caught Marjorie's eye. She didn't flinch, but for the first time, her composed mask seemed to falter. I felt a flicker of satisfaction. The truth was coming out, piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Next came the fire investigator, who meticulously explained the burn patterns and the presence of accelerants. The way he described the methodical spread of the fire left no room for interpretation. This was no accident. The field had been targeted, ignited deliberately, and contained in a way that indicated planning and intent. I listened carefully, noting the detective's careful language, the facts laid out in clear, undeniable terms. Each explanation was another nail in the coffin, and I could feel Marjorie's composure cracking ever so slightly. Then it was my turn to testify. I rose, my legs unsteady, my hands clutching the binder of evidence I had prepared. The memories came back in vivid detail. The smell of smoke, the sight of the blackened field, the long nights spent piecing together evidence and witness statements. I spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure each word counted. I described the sequence of events, the neighbors' accounts, the tire tracks, the chemical residue, and the financial and emotional toll the fire had taken on me. I could feel the jury leaning in, listening, absorbing every detail. I wasn't just recounting facts. I was telling the story of what it meant to have someone destroy not just your property, but the trust and stability that came with it. Marjorie's lawyer tried to challenge me, casting doubt, asking questions meant to undermine my credibility, but I held my ground. I answered clearly, sticking to the facts, refusing to let her tactics sway me. The more she tried, the more obvious it became that there was no way to spin the evidence. The jury could see the burned field in photographs, hear the witness's testimony, and understand the methodical nature of the crime. Marjorie's presence in the room, her attempts to maintain composure, only made the reality of her actions more stark. As the morning wore on, the tension grew unbearable. Every time I glanced at her, I felt a mix of anger and vindication. This was the first time since the fire that I felt a sense of control, a feeling that justice might finally be within reach. The courtroom was a place of rules, evidence, and truth, and in that space, my voice, my preparation, and the facts themselves carried power. I realized that this confrontation, though painful, was necessary. Seeing her there, facing the consequences, made all the sleepless nights, the frustration, and the grief worth it. By the time the court adjourned for a short recess, I felt drained but determined. The evidence had been presented, the witnesses heard, and the jury was processing the reality of what had happened. Marjorie had been brought into the light, forced to sit in the place of accountability. I walked out of the courtroom for a brief moment of air, the autumn breeze cold on my face, and felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and resolve. This wasn't over, but the firestorm that had begun in my field was now burning in the halls of justice, and I was ready to see it through to the end. The courtroom felt electric that morning, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Every eye in the room seemed to be watching, waiting, anticipating the next piece of evidence or testimony that might break the case wide open. I sat in my seat, clutching my notes, listening to the rustle of papers and the low murmur of whispers as the judge called the session to order. This was the point where everything I had painstakingly gathered, the photographs, the witness statements, the tire tracks, and the chemical residues, would be laid bare for scrutiny. There was no turning back now. Every moment, every word, carried weight. The first witness to take the stand was a local farmer who had been working near my field the morning of the fire. He spoke slowly at first, clearly nervous, but as he recounted what he had seen, his confidence grew. He described the dark truck parked at the edge of my property, the smell of fuel and smoke, and the figure moving deliberately among the rows of wheat. I watched as the jury leaned forward, hanging on each word. Marjorie shifted in her seat, her posture taut, her hands clenching the edges of the table. There was no doubt she recognized the significance of what was being said. The witness didn't waver, and with each detail, the net around her tightened. Next came the fire investigator, who had examined my field in painstaking detail. He spoke with authority, explaining how the fire had been deliberately started and controlled. He described the accelerants that had been used, the burn patterns that indicated the fire was set with precision, and the impossibility of it being accidental. I had watched these reports before, studied the photographs and notes, but seeing them presented in court, hearing them analyzed step by step, made the reality of the crime even more chilling. It wasn't just a loss of wheat. It was a calculated attack on my livelihood, my family's heritage, and my sense of security. Then the private investigator I had hired took the stand. He spoke calmly but with conviction, laying out the evidence in a way that connected the dots clearly. He described how the tire tracks matched the make and model of Marjorie's truck, how witnesses had seen her vehicle near my field during the early hours, and how the type of accelerant found at the scene was traced to her purchases in the week leading up to the fire. I watched Marjorie's face, trying to maintain a mask of indifference, but I could see it faltering. Each revelation chipped away at her composed exterior. When it was my turn to testify again, the courtroom seemed to lean in even closer. I told my story, not just the facts, but the emotional impact of the fire. I described the months of preparation for the harvest, the pride I had in the golden fields, and the devastation I felt seeing them reduced to ashes. I spoke of the sleepless nights, the anxiety, and the relentless work to gather evidence. My voice wavered at times, but I pressed on, determined to convey not only what had been done, but how it had felt to have someone destroy something so important to me. The jury listened intently, and for the first time since the fire, I felt a sense of validation. The truth was being heard. Marjorie's lawyer tried to discredit me, attempting to paint me as overly emotional, perhaps even exaggerating the impact of the fire. He asked leading questions, tried to sow doubt, and implied that the witnesses might have been mistaken. But I remained calm, sticking to the facts, referencing the evidence, and answering with precision. The more he pressed, the more obvious it became that the case was not about my credibility. It was about the overwhelming weight of the evidence against his client. The turning point came when a reluctant witness, a neighbor who had previously been too afraid to speak, finally took the stand. His voice was shaky, but the words were clear. He had seen Marjorie moving suspiciously near my field at dawn, carrying what appeared to be containers of flammable liquid. The jury reacted instantly, leaning forward, absorbing the gravity of the statement. Marjorie's face went pale, a stark contrast to the smug composure she had maintained earlier. The room was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that carries the weight of undeniable truth. As the day wore on, more evidence was presented. Receipts from local stores matching purchases of accelerants, surveillance footage showing her vehicle in the vicinity, and expert testimony confirming the fire could only have been started deliberately. Each piece of information layered on top of the last, creating a mosaic that left little room for doubt. I watched the jury taking notes, nodding, clearly engaged with the story that had unfolded before them. By the afternoon, the courtroom had transformed from a formal setting into a stage for justice. Every witness, every piece of evidence, every carefully documented detail built toward the inevitable conclusion. Marjorie sat quietly, occasionally exchanging whispers with her lawyer, but the tension radiating from her was unmistakable. She had underestimated the resolve of someone she thought she could intimidate, and now the courtroom was filled with the weight of consequences she could no longer avoid. When the day's proceedings finally concluded, I stepped outside for a brief moment of air. The sunlight felt sharp on my face, but it also carried a sense of triumph. The evidence had been presented, the witnesses had spoken, and the truth was undeniable. This battle was far from over, but for the first time since the fire, I felt the scales of justice tilting in my favor. I knew the hardest part was still ahead, the final verdict, but I also knew that the truth, meticulously documented and fiercely defended, was on my side. The fire that had taken my wheat had ignited a determination in me that no one could extinguish, and now, for the first time, I could see a path to justice stretching out clearly before me. The day of the verdict arrived with a weight I could feel pressing down from the moment I stepped into the courthouse. The air was thick with anticipation, every person in the room holding their breath as if collectively aware that history was being written in that very chamber. I had been here for weeks, testifying, presenting evidence, listening to witnesses recount what had happened the morning my wheat field burned, and now, all of that effort had led to this single, pivotal moment. Every emotion I had felt since the fire, anger, frustration, grief, and determination, came rushing back in waves, but there was also a strange sense of calm, a feeling that justice was finally within reach. The courtroom was unusually full. Neighbors who had stayed silent during the investigation were now present, leaning forward in their seats, eager to witness the conclusion. Friends and family had come from nearby towns, their presence a quiet show of support. Even some of the community members who had previously supported Marjorie were here, curiosity and the undeniable pull of justice bringing them into the room. The murmurs of the crowd died down as the judge entered, and the gavel struck the bench with a definitive clang, signaling that proceedings were about to resume. Marjorie sat in the defendant's chair, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. There was no smirk this time, no hint of the arrogance that had characterized her demeanor in earlier sessions. Instead, she looked small and tense, her eyes darting occasionally to the jury, then back to her attorney. It was the first time I had seen her appear genuinely uncertain, and though I told myself to focus, a flicker of satisfaction warmed me from inside. I reminded myself that this wasn't about triumph over her as a person. It was about accountability, about ensuring that the law applied to everyone equally, regardless of position or power. The jury filed back in, and the foreperson took a seat, carrying the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on them. The judge recited the charges once more, emphasizing the severity of arson and property destruction. The room was silent, hanging on the edge of what was about to unfold. Every case, every piece of testimony, every photograph of my charred field had led to this moment. I thought of the long hours spent gathering evidence, the painstaking documentation of tire tracks, chemical residues, and witness statements, and felt a sense of resolve. I had done everything possible to ensure the truth was heard, and now it was in the hands of the jury. The deliberation began, and time stretched agonizingly. Minutes felt like hours. Outside, the sunlight shifted, but inside the courtroom, nothing moved except the hands of the clock and the occasional shuffle of papers. I could feel the collective anxiety of everyone present. Conversations were hushed, whispers exchanged in corners, but nothing could distract from the tension that hung over the room. I stared at Marjorie, who remained silent, her face a mask of controlled worry, and for the first time, I sensed real fear. When the jury finally returned, every head in the courtroom turned. The foreperson approached the bench with deliberate steps, and the silence became almost unbearable. I felt my own pulse quicken, my stomach tight with anticipation. The foreperson cleared their throat and began to speak, recounting the jury's decision. Guilty. The word reverberated through the room, a sound so satisfying I could barely contain it. Marjorie's eyes widened, and for the first time, the confident, untouchable persona she had maintained for so long seemed to crumble. She looked around, perhaps hoping for sympathy, or maybe disbelief, but the jury's verdict left no room for either. The judge pronounced the sentence formally, outlining the consequences of arson, property destruction, and the financial restitution she would be required to provide. It was enough to cover not only the loss of my wheat, but also the emotional and financial toll her actions had taken on me. Marjorie's lawyer attempted to interject, questioning the severity, but the judge held firm, emphasizing the deliberate nature of her crime and the clear evidence presented. I felt a rush of relief, but also a quiet, solemn satisfaction. Justice had been served, and it had been thorough. As Marjorie was escorted from the courtroom, I found myself walking through the rows of seats, receiving nods of acknowledgement and quiet congratulations from neighbors and friends. The weight of the fire, the months of stress and uncertainty, had lifted slightly, replaced by the sense that my efforts had mattered, that standing firm in the face of destruction had been worth it. I thought about the wheat fields, the charred remains of my harvest, and realized that while the fire had taken the tangible crops, it could never destroy the determination and resilience that had brought me through it. Walking outside into the crisp autumn air, I inhaled deeply, letting the sunlight and breeze fill my lungs. There was a strange serenity in the knowledge that accountability had been enforced. The world felt more balanced, fairer somehow, because the truth had prevailed. I glanced back at the courthouse one last time, understanding that this chapter of conflict was closing, but the lessons would remain. I had learned the power of persistence, the importance of evidence, and the necessity of standing up for oneself, even against intimidation and authority. That evening, I returned to the remnants of my field. The blackened stalks still crumbled under my touch, but I didn't feel the same despair I had on the day of the fire. Instead, I felt resolve, a quiet determination to rebuild, to plan again, and to honor the legacy of hard work that my family had passed down. The soil was ready, the land still mine, and the future uncertain but filled with possibility. I realized that the fire, while destructive, had also ignited a fire within me, a drive to protect what I loved and to ensure that no one could take it from me without consequence. Justice had been served, yes, but the story didn't end there. It ended with reflection, resilience, and the knowledge that standing firm in the face of wrongdoing was always worth the struggle. I would rebuild my fields, tend my land, and continue the work my family had started, stronger and more vigilant than ever before. The fire had burned wheat, but it could never burn determination, integrity, or the pursuit of justice. And for that, I felt a deep and lasting sense of closure.